Let's focus on the early modern period here, and we know that the early modern period was 1500 to 1750, and let's have a look at the historical context. So we know that during this era there was a sense of extreme religious intensity. This intensity here revolved around the group known as the Puritans, and the Puritans had an intolerance to anybody who did not also share their extreme religious views. London became the biggest city in Europe. It became a centre for commercial trade, and trading increased taxes, so it raised revenue for the king and the government. Those taxes were put on foreign goods that came into the country, for example, silk, tobacco, etc., and that made the goods more expensive, but the king got some tax. Some improvements took place in transport. There were very, very early developments in roads, but nevertheless, the road network began to slowly develop. We've mentioned the extreme Christian views that were in place, but Puritans, they were very influential. They had a presence in Parliament. They were members of Parliament so that they could influence the law. There's that continuity of strong beliefs in the devil that maintained from the medieval period, and during this era there was an increase in population. It almost doubled, but also that led to falling wages from the workers because there were more workers now, so wages went down because people like lords of the manor could pay them what they wanted to some extent. And as a result of there being more people, there was less food, so prices went up. So it can be argued that due to the economics of the period, falling wages and high food prices, that led to an increase in theft. Moving on, where we'll look at the prevailing attitude of the time, there is a level of continuity again, that crime was the devil's work, and we always refer to it as ret and det. That continues during this era. So we've got deterrence. Let's make the punishment so tough that people won't do them again or publicly humiliate them, and let's get revenge as well. The new crimes during this era were linked to the historical context. So, for instance, because we've got the highway robbery, was linked to the new basic roads. So they were really attractive for criminals who could easily rob the stagecoach. Remember, people would carry their belongings with them, their valuables with them, so there were no banks at the time, so when people were travelling long distances, they'd have valuables on them. Witchcraft was linked to the strong belief in the devil, the historical context. In addition to that, because London and England was such a commercial trading centre, because there were taxes on goods, then that led to smuggling. In addition to that, we've also got moral crimes that the Puritans introduced. Those moral crimes revolved around drunkenness and sex outside of marriage, or we refer to it as fornication and swearing. So you've got a load of new crimes here that are linked to the historical context. Moving forward, we've got some different punishments here. And we've just touched upon fornication. That's that notion of sex outside of marriage. And the punishment for that would be public penance. And public penance would be to stand up in front of the church congregation on a Sunday and be forced to apologise and ask for forgiveness. Now, some people said in class that wasn't a big deal, but don't forget that this idea of sex outside of marriage, that would be seen as being unclean and unchristian. You would be a social outcast for that. So this public penance is a form of public humiliation. In addition to that, those punishments around public humiliation continued from the medieval period. We've got the pillory, where the head and the hands are trapped. We've got the stocks, where it was the hands and their ankles. The skull's bridle. So don't forget, it was illegal for a woman to shout and bawl and swear and things like that. That could be like a metal bridle. Whipping and branding, that idea of corporal punishment, was common throughout this era. Branding, so they might brand a T onto somebody's forehead to represent theft. And don't forget bridewells, the first real prison for people who had committed crimes other than debt were introduced during this period. And a bridewell was a prison, but they were forced to work really intensively. Finally, looking at the enforcement, we've got this new role of the watchman. It's not the police, but it's a watchman. Essentially, it's like a very basic security guard who would keep an eye on the town or city's walls for drunkenness or anybody who was trying to get in to cause any bother. We know that the role of the Justice of the Peace grew in importance during this era. So the role of the JP, don't forget it used to be called the Guardian of the Peace. That gives you a better understanding of the role. So it wasn't just about dealing with crimes, but it was all about guarding the peace. And remember, it used to check on weights and measures in markets, etc. The courts changed. So remember, we've got the assize courts. The assize courts were for the serious crimes. So serious for assize. That's how we've been remembering it. Serious crimes for assize. That took over the royal courts. We've also got the quarter sessions, and they took over for the petty crimes. They took over the manor courts. Don't forget, it was during this period of the 1688 that idea of the bloody code was introduced. This was the idea that members of Parliament wanted was practically preserve their own status. So they introduced more and more laws that would lead to the death penalty. So it was about preserving the status quo of the rich. The Black Act in 1723 led to 200 instances of capital punishment. So what I mean by over 200 instances is, for instance, if you were caught poaching fish from a landowner, poaching deer, or even cutting down a live tree from a wealthy landowner, because that would affect his own wealth, that was seen as an act. And by 1723, there were 200 instances that could lead to you being hanged.